Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my new course on the Jews of Hungary. It's great to be back with you. As you know, when I do these courses for Beit Avichai, it's very important for me to be able to show you places to visit when you go to Hungary, and you can understand the Jewish history through the extant places that are still there to be seen. So let me begin by telling you how our 4 sessions will be put together. Today, we are going to explore the Jews of Hungary in medieval times up to the 15th century, where limited sources, tombstones, decrees, and scattered references leave Jews as these shadowy figures reacting to shifting conditions. We will visit Castle Hill in Budapest, site of the earliest known Jewish settlement, as well as Sopron, home to 2 preserved 14th century synagogues. Next Sunday, we will study our Jews of Hungary under the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, highlighting the 15th century creation of a Jewish prefect and what his role was. We will talk a little bit about Jewish women in the early modern period, and I will discuss with you the remarkable case of Shlomo Shter Zalman, a Jewish courtier who converted to Christianity, yet continued to advocate for his former community. In our 3rd session together, we will turn to emancipation versus Hasidut. And I'm going to show you how emancipation in 19th century Hungary brought both new opportunities and deepening divisions within Hungarian Jewry between Orthodox and secular Jews. Here we will visit the synagogue in Miskolc and, of course, the great Dohani synagogue in Budapest, which are symbols, I think, of these diverging identities. Our final session together will turn to the rise and the fall in the 20th century, examining, of course, the rising antisemitism, the White Terror, and events leading to the German invasion in 1944. And I will show you how, despite this, from emancipation through to the end of World War I, Jews felt deeply at home in Hungary, with many achieving prominence in government, in culture, and society. We will celebrate together one of the most beautiful synagogues that we know in Europe and see its flourishing life, its architectural splendor. I wanted to give you both an image of the synagogue on the outside, but also inside. Just look at that incredible dome from the inside. And this was the new synagogue, a jewel of Hungarian Art Nouveau. So let's go back to the roots of Jews in Hungary. Well, Hagar was the commonly used name for Hungary in Jewish medieval literature and onward. And the expression Eretz Hagar occurs in Rashi, as you see here on Yoma 11a, in a responsum of the French Tosaphist Isaac ben Avraham, who died around 1200. The term Eretz Hagar also appears in the Or Zarua of Isaac ben Moshe of Vienna, the Riaz, who lived between 1200 and 1270. Why would Hungary be called by the Jews Eretz Hagar? Was it perhaps an estranged land for Jews to live because Hagar had been estranged from Avraham? Or was it estranged because until 1500, the Jews in Hungary were not a productive community in terms of their literary output? They seem to have written no books, no responsa literature, not even letters of any kind or notes. That is to say, no Jewish documents through which the historian could gain insight into their lives. We know that what we know about these Jews until 1500 is based almost entirely on a few of these tombstones and inscriptions, and from the 11th century onwards, we have royal and ecclesiastical decrees related to them, as well as other documents and letters issued by authorities that I will discuss with you during our series together, and a few references in the Hebrew writings of other lands. We also know the names of only a few individual Jews until the 15th century, and I'm going to mention them later this evening. So what about non-Jewish sources? Can these tell us something about the medieval first Jews who are living in Hungary? Well, we have these official decrees and other documents that reveal that Jewish communities existed in many towns and localities in Hungary. We can see their occupations, their financial status, and the taxes that they paid, the rights and privileges that were granted to them, their inabilities, restrictions imposed upon them, and the attitude of the non-Jews towards them. And while this gives us some idea as to the life of the Jews of Hungary, as a group, they remained throughout these centuries, as I said earlier, shadowy figures, clearly underprivileged people who acted, or rather reacted as groups, to the varying conditions under which they were forced to live. So this lecture on the foundation history of our Jews in Hungary, I want to do the following. I'm going to start by discussing the origins of the Jewish community in Hungary. I'm then going to turn to an event in the 11th century, which records, I think, a lot to enlighten us about these Hungarian Jews. I want you to see this fascinating episode as a way of getting to know them. I'm then going to look at the extant synagogues of our Jews from these periods, the 3 synagogues that I mentioned earlier, from the medieval synagogues that are definitely worth a visit. And then I'm going to turn to the king's relationship with the Jews. What do we know from these royal documents? What does it tell us about the Jews, and in light of their connection, of course, with the king? So let's go back to the Roman period. And we have a few inscriptions on tombs and other monuments that show that Jews and Syrians did live in various parts of Pannonia that you see here, the province of the Roman Empire that included parts of Western Hungary. And especially in this area, if you can see, of the Danube, and you can see it particularly on this map, from the 2nd or 3rd century. But we don't know a lot beyond that. We have monuments that have been found in Solva in the Roman name, which is the Roman name, of course, for Esztergom. And here you can see a Roman monument. Here is Esztergom for you. And under here we have Emperor Alexander Severus. Jews had full security and were free to practice their religion and even enjoyed privileges in this area. And just to prove that this is the case, I wanted to share with you this Jewish dedication stone that was written to the emperor, and here you can see the translation of the stone. So we know the Jewish presence is there, and we know that they are paying homage to Severus. And this data, I would say meager in themselves, are supplemented by information from the writers and the historians of the period, who frequently remarked that Jews were not different from others among whom they lived in either custom or costume. The Jews were known to be excellent soldiers in the Roman Empire and hence filled important positions in the army, and their expertise and talent also enabled them to participate effectively in the economic life of the provinces. After the Roman period, for about half a millennium, the history of the Carpathian basin is wrapped in almost impenetrable darkness. Then we have the conquest of it by the Hungarians in the late 9th century. And the search for the origins of the Jewish groups that come to live in Hungary leads us, of course, into Central Asia, whence the Hungarians came from, and where they had contact with the Khazar kingdom, for which historical documents are somewhat more plentiful. When one thinks of the Khazars, I tend, of course, as a Jewish historian, to think about the learned medieval Spanish Jewish philosopher and physician and poet Yehuda Halevi, who of course wrote the Kuzari. It was completed in 1139 to 40, and here you can see a copy of it. Now, this text takes the form, of course, of a dialogue between the rabbi and the king of the Khazars, who has invited the rabbi to instruct him in the tenets of Judaism in comparison with those of Christianity and Islam. The Khazars were part of a kingdom, and you can see it here in yellow, which extended over the area bounded by the Crimea and the Black Sea in the west and by the Volga River in the east. In the middle of the 8th century, their king and nobles converted to Judaism, and some 2 centuries later, the empire disintegrates under repeated attacks by the Russians. And it would seem that some Jewish Khazars then joined the Jewish Kabars of this Magyar confederation, who were fleeing the Russians in the 9th century, and together left the north of the Black Sea and started their westward trek to cross the Carpathians into Hungary. The Jewish Khazar presence among them is indicated by a rare find, a Khazar ring that you see here with Hebrew letters that was unearthed at Elend near Pech. And you can see the letters here. And some of the available data about the Jewish Khazars and Kabars have led historians to the conclusion that their Jewishness was less complete, in fact rather partial and superficial. Nothing is known of the relationship that developed between these Jewish or half-Jewish Khazars and Kabars on the one hand, and the older Jewish inhabitants that had already been in this Carpathian basin on the other hand. But the general Jewish proclivity to seek out and establish relations with other Jews furnishes, I think, some basis for assuming that once the trauma of being overrun and subjugated by invading warlike tribes had subsided, the old Jewish inhabitants managed to establish contact with those of the invaders, who observed some Jewish precepts definitely and succeeded in drawing them fully into the Jewish community. And we know that under King Istvan I, who was ruled from 997 to 1038, he's the first king of Hungary, and his successors, all the Magyars, of course except the Jews, convert to Christianity. It becomes a Christian kingdom, sometimes by force. And this development opened the door to closer contact with the economically and culturally more advanced countries of Central and Western Europe. And here you can see how everything is beginning to be established, trade routes and people coming in to Hungary to live there. For several more centuries, Hungary did not adopt the typical medieval Western anti-Jewish position that I've talked about with you when we've studied other places. And there were no attempts to convert Jewish or Muslim merchants to Christianity, even though this has become a Christian kingdom. Jews were allowed to be Jews. This meant they were particularly dependent on the will of the king, provided them with royal protection against arbitrary exploitation by the towns where most of the Jews lived. So now let's turn to our interesting case that I mentioned at the beginning, recorded as happening in the 11th century, but it was only recorded in a 13th century Jewish source. A description of this incident that I'm going to talk with you about in a moment found its way into this 13th century halachic compendium, Shibbolei Haleket, authored by the Rabbi of Rome, Abraham Sedekiah Harofei Anav. The account that I'm going to read to you now is of such importance for the history of the Jews of Hungary in the 11th century because it is a period, as I've already said, in which no Jewish documents really exists. So what does the document tell us? Well, it seems that about 1050, an incident in itself insignificant took place in Esztergom that you see here, a city on the right side, as you can see here. I hope I got my map. Yeah, there's the map. It's showing you exactly where it is on the right side of the Danube, 30 miles north of Budapest, that left its traces definitely in rabbinical literature of the age and throws some light about the Jews who were living there at that time. Esztergom's advantageous location on the banks of the Danube and along a main commercial route between Eastern and Central Europe definitely attracted many traveling merchants. So we have to understand this is a place where people are coming and going all the time, and the Jewish community that's established there knows that this is part of their existence. People come and go. Now we know that two brothers, Jewish merchants, Abraham and Yaakov, from Regensburg in Germany, were on their way back from Russia when, not far from Esztergom, a wheel of their heavily laden wagon broke. This happened on a Friday, and by the time the damage was repaired and they could drive on, it was late in the day, so that they arrived in the city after the onset of the Sabbath, of Shabbat, a blatant desecration, of course, of the holy day. So you can imagine the Jewish community have met to pray on Friday, and in comes these two Jews riding their wagon, even though the Sabbath has already started. And for this, Kalonymus, the rabbi of the community, imposed a heavy fine on these two men. And now I'm going to pick up by translating the text, showing you a translation of the text into English. And this is the sentence passed by our master Kalonymus, son of Rabbi Shabtai the Chazan, or cantor of blessed memory, in the land of Hagar, right? We said it's called Hagar, Hungary, on Rabbi Abraham, son of Rabbi Chia of Regensburg, and his brother, Rabbi Yaakov, who came from Russia with laden wagons on the eve of the Shabbat, while it was still day, with non-Jewish hirelings and with their Jewish companions to the community. And they remained on this side of the river Danube at a distance of little less than a mile, for one of the wheels of their wagon had broken, and they tarried there until they had repaired it. And he goes on. And when they reached the community, the people of the community were just coming out of the synagogue on the eve of Shabbat. And the community did not give them peace, or did not greet them, and did not let them enter next morning into the synagogue, lest others draw an inference from them, from minor to major, saying, this is how N and N, obviously just the standard fit in whatever you want name, acted. And hence we can act likewise. If these men give the example of people traveling on Shabbat, we're setting a very bad example. And lest an even greater breach be made, of course, by desecrating the Shabbat willfully. And on the first of the week, Sunday, they came to the synagogue to receive their sentence. And here we have it. And they were ordered to fast 7 weeks, 50 consecutive days, except the Shabbat and holidays and new moons, to fulfill 50 work days in fasting and lashing. And why 50 days? For he who desecrates the Shabbat becomes deserving of karet, which of course is divine punishment by premature death, but that's not going to happen. And they also imposed on them to give them their own money, a life ransom, to the alms box. And then they ordered them to fast 3 days every month of the 12 months of the year, on Monday and Thursday, and then the following Monday, which are 36 days, as against the 36 karat, or punishments, contained in the Torah. Okay, interesting. A text, I hope you'll agree with me, that could tell us quite a lot about the Jewish community in 11th century Hungary. The brief account, I think, provides rare insights into this strict disciplinary conditions of the Hungarian Jews in a city, of course, along the banks of the Danube, as I said, in the 11th century. We learn that Jewish merchants passed through Hungary on their way from Russia to Germany, and that it was their custom to spend a Shabbat as guests in one of the local Jewish communities. The town at this time in which the two men arrived clearly had an organized Jewish community with a Beit Din, a religious court headed by Rabbi Kalonymus. It had a charity organization which the members of the community supported by putting money in the alms box, which I think is also an important gesture that we see that this was something in the synagogue that was used. What else can we say? Well, the leaders of the community had the authority to arrest Jewish persons guilty of a transgression who lived outside the location, and to punish them with the full severity of halachic law. Had that not been the case, the two Regensburg Jews would have at any rate, or could have, simply left the city Sunday morning instead of having to appear before the court, which is what they had to do on the Sunday morning. These two merchants, not particularly observant from what we can see, or not sensitive to the orthodoxy of the community, they rode into town on their repaired wagon after the onset of Shabbat. On the other hand, I hope you'll agree with me, the local Jewish community is deeply religious. They were so scandalized by the arrival of these two Regensburg Jews after the onset of Shabbat. They refused to welcome them, and even the next morning, they barred them from entering the synagogue and attending the Shabbat service. And it is clear from our sources that the rabbi was this Rabbi Kalonymus ben Shabtai, who was a well-known, highly respected Italian rabbi, and who had actually served in Esztergom for a period of unknown length in the capacity of the Av Bet Din, the head of the religious court, before he returned to Rome. Sometime later, he moved to Worms in the Rhineland, where he functions as the head of the Talmudic school. He was a man of great learning and reputation, as we know from a remark that was made by Rashi, who writes in his comments, "Just now," he says, "came to me a letter from Worms that informs me that a great old man arrived there from Rome. He sits and presides in the yeshiva, and his name is Rabbi Kalonymus, and he is an expert in all the Talmud and the Torah," which is so nice to be able to get this sort of impression of him from somebody as famous as Rashi. And it must have been while he was back in Rome that Rabbi Kalonymus told his colleagues of his experiences in Hungary, and it was thus that a report of this incident found itself into the Shibbolei Haleket that I mentioned earlier, that was written in Rome 2 centuries later. And I want us to stop at this moment to go physically with you to Sopron to visualize a medieval synagogue, a little bit later than what we've seen in the story, but let's get an idea of what it was like to be a medieval Jew living in Hungary and where they prayed. This was a place where there was clearly an established community, also under a rabbi. And here I'm showing you the Jewish area of Sopron today, and the remaining synagogue, which was built around 1300, so definitely the oldest that we have. This is the path up to the synagogue. And at the time, what we know about Sopron and the Jewish community, it seems there were between, I would say, 10 and 16 Jewish households that would pray in this synagogue. So this is just to give you as much visual identity as I can regarding the synagogue. This is what it looks like inside. And notice, of course, its Gothic-styled room. That's not surprising. This is the period. But I wanted to show you in particular something that really struck me, which was its stone-sculptured Aron Kodesh, which, as you can see, is surrounded by a frieze adorned with grapes and fig leaves in homage, of course, to wine, a symbol of life and celebration. The builders probably Christians, but the layout of the synagogue and even the decoration was designed definitely by the Jews. And like in Speyer, what really struck me when I was standing there, and I'm going to show you here if I may, you have this small window where behind, you assume, because of the very similar look that you have also in Speyer, of where the women would sit separately and be able to look through this very small sort of a piece that you can see in the middle, and that on that side would be the women. And I imagine, and I'm sure others do as well, that this is the same that you have here in Sopron. The women were sitting separately in an adjacent room, expected to participate in the service only through this very small niche, as you can see. So this is Sopron. Let me just also mention that there is still a mikveh there that you can see, and here you have the steps going down. But there are two synagogues in Sopron that you will see when you will visit. The second synagogue, in fact, now was a private synagogue at the time. It was not the public one that I just showed you. It was another one. It has now been turned into the Jewish museum of the area, so you can see many people actually there. And this is the remains. I think obviously they've been renovated, of the Aron Kodesh actually in that building. So that's our first medieval example, still extant today, of synagogues in Hungary. Another wonderful example in the area of Buda Castle, of course, in Castle Hill in Buda. This is the first synagogue of the Jewish community that was built simultaneously with the foundation of the town. I think obviously as early as the middle of the 13th century. It was still being used at the beginning of the 15th century. That synagogue was standing next to a gate tower of the town called the Jewish Gate. What we have here today that we can still see is probably the next level of synagogue, where it moved to after the initial synagogue was founded. This was the synagogue on the Jewish quarter. It probably moved to this site in the 15th century. It's a late Gothic style, and was used definitely until 1686, the day when the town was reconquered from the Ottomans by the Allied Christian forces. We have here some really interesting wall decoration that I wanted to show you. It's really, for me, it was sort of a moment of real understanding of sort of a folklorish art as opposed to something that's really beautiful, something very much coming from the people. This is something that didn't necessarily take a lot of time, but I would say has a lot of amuletic meaning for the people themselves. And what you see here are two specific drawings. The one on the left, as you can see, is some sort of bow and arrow with the arrow pointing upwards. And this has, as you can see here, a verse from the prayer of Hannah, which comes from the first book of Shmuel. And here you can see this is what they are. The other one is a Magen David, although we mustn't understand it as being a Magen David. It's not necessarily at this time, it's definitely not at this time a Jewish symbol, but what you have is something that gives the ability to put the priestly prayer inside. Let me show you here. And it has this amuletic formula, that it's somehow there to protect the Jews from something. So again, I think this is a really wonderful way of getting to know our Jews. Why are these texts written like this on the wall, rather amateurishly on the wall? Did they perhaps reflect, and this is something I was thinking about when I was there, the Jews' concern that maybe life was unpredictable, and therefore there was a need to make there wasn't a need to make more permanent decorations on the wall because the synagogue might have to move again. They wanted to have something on the wall that would give them this amuletic protection, but not anything more. The Hebrew letters actually reflect the influence of Turkish handwriting in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this inscription referred definitely to sieges in which it is hoped that the Ottomans would eventually defend Buda Castle. So we have no exact understanding of when they are. They could have been something earlier, something that was painted on later, but definitely gives us some contact with the Jews who prayed there. And these mural amulets definitely are asking God for his help. We also have in the synagogue a dedication, but also the keystone of the synagogue, which can actually be seen as well. And this too is wonderful to be able to see the original one. And the tombstones here inside this area of where this synagogue were brought from the Jewish cemetery that is no longer in Buda. The cemetery of the Jewish community, when Buda was founded, was located on the western foot of the hill, and it would be transferred during the Ottoman period that I'll mention in my next class to a different location. So what was Jewish life like at this time? Well, as I mentioned before, besides this brief spell of Rabbi Kalonymus in Esztergom, we don't have the names of any scholars or rabbis from Hungary. It seems that the Jews of Hungary at this time had few rabbis, cantors, or teachers, and their familiarity with Jewish liturgy and ritual was rather poor. What we do have are other examples of foreign rabbis coming to Hungary, or rabbis born in Hungary actually leaving and going to other communities. We think that Rabbi Isaac ben Moshe, who wrote the Or Zarua at the beginning in the relation to the term Hagar that I talked about, came from Esztergom and from Buda. In both communities, the local Jews asked him whether it was permitted for women to use the local hot springs, already famous then, but definitely didn't look like this, as they look like today in Budapest, as their prescribed ritual bath. Can women of the medieval period go and use these baths, these famous hot baths, as ways of doing their monthly purification? The rabbi responded, yes, it was permissible. And I think the reason for the Hungarian Jews' lack of Talmudic scholarship and rabbinical authorship is probably the generally low level of education and culture that characterized not only the Jews, but even so the Christians, definitely up to at least the 1400s. In any case, the Jews of Hungary were, until the 15th century, a Jewishly ignorant community, as is evident from the conspicuous absence of Jewish literary works until that time. So that's looking and trying to use as much Jewish sources as we can. I want us now to go back in time a little bit and to consider the topic of the Hungarian king and his relationship with the Jews. The king of Hungary was the ruling head of state of the Kingdom of Hungary from, as I said, the year 1000 or 1001, right up to 1918. The first king of Hungary that I mentioned before, Istvan I, was crowned on the 25th of December 1000 or the 1st of January 1001, still not quite clear, with the crown that Pope Sylvester II had sent him and with the consent of Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor. And over the centuries, the kings of Hungary acquired or claimed the crown of several neighboring countries, and these are them, and they began to use the royal titles connected to those countries, as you see. So it often included the lands around, and it's not always just talking about Hungary. And thanks to documents preserved in Hungarian archives, we know a little more about the position of the Jews in relation to the country's rulers and cities. Because it was under the reign of King Edrei II, who ruled between 1205 and 1235, and his son, King Bela IV, 1235 to 70, that we hear for the first time of prominent, wealthy Jews known by name, and we learn at least something about the role that they played in the country. One such man was the highly influential Jewish treasury count, Terah, whose name appears in contemporary documents in many forms. And here I've listed all the times that I've found his name. Terah was probably born between 1180 and 1190 and died probably around the year 1241 or 1242. His father, whose name we don't know, was a rich man who must have performed valuable services to the crown, for as one source states, he, quote, owned since antiquity, thanks to royal liberality, the villa Bessenio. That is Bessenye, to which belonged extensive landed properties. And the same document refers to the son, the Jew or the Count Terah, as a hospes or a guest, possibly indicating that he himself was of foreign origin and came into Hungary. After the death of his father, Terah remains in possession of Bessenye estate until 1232. And in addition, he also owned an estate near Sopron. We also hear about him in a document from 1225 when King Edre II enters into an agreement with the Austrian Duke Leopold, who undertook to pay the king 2,000 marks. Now, any of these sort of treaties that are going on, I want you to understand, means the involvement of Terah. He's involved, he's providing the money, and he's there to serve the king. The payment of this amount was given in 2 installments and was guaranteed by Terah. Nothing more is known of this transaction, but one thing is clear. Terah must have been, by that time, an established high financier, very rich, able to undertake the payment of what was a huge amount, and he was a man whose financial responsibility the king, the Hungarian king, relied upon more than that of an Austrian duke. And despite his financial talents, we assume that Terah gets himself into trouble and he has to leave Hungary at a certain point. Why? Well, these are the days when the church increasingly pressures the king to limit the activities of Jews in the country. And in 1233, the king actually enters into the so-called Bereg agreement, which made it impossible for Terah to retain a high position anymore, or even to appear in public without him wearing a Jewish badge. 1233, it's already happened in other parts of Europe. We should not be surprised that it has come to Hungary. But this proves to be temporary. We don't know when exactly Terah leaves Hungary, but by 1235 we find him in Vienna, where he continues his large-scale money business in partnership with several Viennese bankers. The threat of the Mongol invasion forces King Bela IV to rescind that part of the Bereg agreement that had barred Terah from public office. This induces Terah to come back to Hungary, where he again holds a high position. And what office now he was given in light of the Bereg agreement that has already happened but not really been accepted, we don't know, but it most likely had to do, of course, with the royal treasury. He seems to have loaned large amounts of money to the king, who was in dire need of funds for his preparations to resist the Mongols. And in gratitude, King Bela presents Terah with another large estate called Chenke on the banks of the river Danube. Another high financial officer known from the time of King Bela is Henuk, a Jew of German or Austrian origin who also is appointed treasury count by the king and entrusted with the management of the royal revenues. And he seems to have filled the same position Terhad had prior to the Mongol invasion. And after that invasion, as a reward for large loans or other meritorious work, the king gives Henuk the castle of Khamaron that you see here, with its estate of 21 villages, as well as a mill located next to the castle. We know that Henuk dies shortly before 1265, owing the royal treasury a large sum. So what does this picture allow us to assume? Well, Jews are increasingly settling in the towns, establishing communities there, as we have seen from our 3 extant synagogues, 2, of course, in Sopron and 1 in Castle Hill. Relics of synagogues and cemeteries attest to continuous Jewish presence in these cities and towns. We have mentioned Esztergom in the mid-11th century. Then we have Buda and Óbuda, and Óbuda was a town that later merges with Buda and Pest, as you see here in 1873. Another important Jewish area that we should keep in the back of our mind is Pannonia, because Pannonia or Pressburg at this time is part of Hungary. It's first mentioned in Chronicles in 1092. Now, of course, it is Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. A memorial book is also another place that tells us something about the Jewish community. This is the Memoriebuch of the Jewish community in Mainz, which mentions that Jewish martyrs from Pressburg or Pannonia apparently perished during the First Crusade. But in general, at this difficult time, and I'll just go back again for a slide to see here, you can see this is the map of the First Crusade. This is at the 11th century. We can assume that some of the Crusaders on their way to Jerusalem actually harmed the Jews of Pressburg. But the king at this time, and here I'm just going to go back to Colmar. I'm going too fast, I'm not pressing the right button. Just go back to our map. Here we have here we have King Colmar. He's the learned, the book lover, or the bookish king. He actually prevented the incursion of the Crusaders into Hungary. The only place we know that Jews were hurt was definitely in Pressburg. And the events of 1096 were followed by this influx of Jewish refugees who come into Hungary. They see what Colmar has done, and they think that it might be a good place to live because they were protected. The Jews were protected in Hungary where they weren't protected elsewhere. Here we have, of course, one of the famous images of the Jews being killed by the Crusaders in the First Crusade. But I want you to understand that as we're thinking about these early centuries, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, these are the places without doubt where we know Jewish settlement is being established. And the idea of Hungary being a safe haven for Jews was actually short-lived due to an increase in anti-Judaism. This is not anti-Semitism. I always keep the two very much separate, because if Jews convert to Christianity in this period, the hatred of the Jew is supposed to, and often does, dissipate. The same king who would save the Jew from the Crusaders decided in 1092 that the Jews of Hungary were no longer allowed to own Christian slaves. Now, this is going to be important for Jews because we know that at this time they can own land. If they can't use slaves, then they are very much stranded in who they can have to work for, because as Jews, it's difficult for them to employ Christians. From this we learn, as I said, that Jews did have property, as well as pagan slaves who worked for them, as in the case, of course, of Christian landowners. And this general prohibition of hiring slaves did not apply to those few Jews who had achieved exceptionally high positions, outstanding Jewish nobles and high officials, still able to own estates at this time, even though we can feel the pressure of the church to actually do this at the time. Other rulings include the following: no loans between Jews and Christians without witnesses and guarantors. So we again see that Jews are moving to being moneylenders here as they were in Western Europe. Very much a profession that works for them. The Christians need them. The king is always going to need money. It's not really surprising that this reaches here. And the other one, of course, any buying or selling to be done before Christian and Jewish witnesses. This idea that you have to report the transactions that you do with Christians all the time. And the Jews continue to live in the cities where they engage in money lending and in buying and selling merchandise. They play an important role in the country's economy, making it necessary to issue these specific rulings covering their activities. And they still owned land. How do we know that? Because of this word shido that we see in many documents, which confirms to us that Jews are having the property of land, and in the opinion of Hungarian historical linguists, definitely confirms this Jewish land ownerships. Documents mention the existence next to Nitra, today Nitra in Slovakia, of a Mons Eodorum, a Jewish mountain, a Jew's mountain, in 1113, and also refers to a Castrum Eodorum, a Jew's castle, in 1247. So definitely presence of Jews living here. Unfortunately, the medieval church continues with its pressure on the Hungarian kings to increase anti-Judaism. We have an exchange of letters between Pope Gregory IX and Robert, Archbishop of Esztergom, in 1231. A year later, King Edre issues his so-called second decretum, in which he repeated the exclusion of Jews from public office. And the very fact that the same anti-Jewish provisions were repeated again and again indicates that these were not often kept to or even carried out. Jews continued to be monetary officials in charge of the royal mint, and they work as tax collectors, tributari, for the royal and ecclesiastical courts. That Jews were in charge of the royal mint as late as the reign of King Istvan that you see here, the fifth, is proven, in fact, by coins from the period, which have been shown to actually have Hebrew letters in their markings, as you see here. And that's to record the chief mint's name actually in the coin. And as for the taxes, until the end of the Olpadian period, meaning the kings of Hungary from the Olpad royal house, which is about 1300, they were administered by Jews. In the second half of the 13th century, the Roman Church intensifies its efforts to restrict the influence and the position of the Jews in Hungary. We know that Pope Nicholas III, that you see here, dispatches Bishop Philip of Fermo to Hungary, ostensibly for the purpose of tightening what he considers a sort of slackened Christian discipline, but in actuality for the equally important task of trying to deprive Jews of their rights and privileges. And not surprisingly, we have an article at this time, 125, which deals with Jews. And now this idea that the Jews should wear a badge is coming from higher and stronger powers, not just the king, but also the Pope. And the ruling concludes that Jews and Saracens are not supposed to collect taxes and tolls. But since the council has to disband before finishing its work, the king was unhappy to agree to what he saw as infringements upon his own rights to the crown. These resolutions were not properly publicized and had little effect. Not surprisingly, too, with this increasing anti-Judaism from the church, we have our first case of ritual murder in Hungary. It's happened elsewhere, and it happens here again. This we know about from the Memorbuch of Mainz that I mentioned afterwards, because it happens in Pressburg, it happens in Pannonia, and it's relating specifically to an event that we think happened between 1243 and 1287 and involved a boy, as it always does. Sorry, a Christian boy, as it always does. I also want to refer to the forced conversion a century later of King Lajos or Lajos that you see here. He completed his conquest of Serbia and forced its population to convert to Catholicism. He turns his attention to Jews and pagans inside Hungary, and he tries to actually get them to convert to Christian as well. He promised that if they converted, they would enjoy all the rights and freedoms of the Christian Hungarians, as well as full tax exemption. He repeats these offers several times. He had the prelates of the church preach to the Jews and exhort them to convert to Christianity. This is done through sermons that the Jews have to listen to. And he doesn't get anywhere because the Jews are stubborn and refuse to convert. At that point in 1360, he orders the Jews of Hungary to be expelled. We shouldn't see that as surprising. This has happened in other places in Europe. The pressure is, if you Jews do not convert to Christianity, let's get rid of them. Most of the expelled Jews at this point go to Austria and Moravia. But what's so interesting is that the banishment only lasts 4 years. Because after, in 1364, the king is desperate to have his Jews back and he allows them in. And it seems that our Jews were versatile and utilized these years of their exclusion from Hungary to engage in financial transactions in the countries that actually admitted them. That they were successful in this is evident from the fact that they were allowed to return to Hungary, many of them preferring, of course, to stay in other places where they had already stayed. But that's something that happens at this time. I want to, in the time that we have left, mention 2 new institutions, I would say positions of non-Jews who now take over and act as judges for the Jewish people and the Jewish communities that are in existence in Hungary at this time. I want to mention what's known as the Judex Iudeorum, the national Jewish judge, and I of course will finish with this. This is a judge who is not Jewish, he's a Christian. This is very important. The idea is to have a Christian who will really be responsible for all the Jewish communities now, and this is done by King Lajos as well. The judge is going to be in control of all the Jews to see that they fulfill their obligations, that they pay their taxes, of course, to the crown, and also to make sure that they're protected in person and property from the church, the cities, and all other elements that were against them. And already in 1251, the Jewish law, which gave Jews certain rights and privileges, mentioned the position of the Jew judge. And I'm going to talk about this law a little bit more in my next lecture. But note, in fact, that the Jews judges are always going to be, at this point, Christian noblemen of high standing, whom the king appointed from among the leading citizens of his cities. And it appears that his primary task was to adjudicate in litigations that arose between Jews and Christians. And building on this pre-existing institution, Lajos the Great also created another office, that of the Judex Iudeorum Totius Regni, the judge of the Jews of the whole kingdom. So another position also given to a Christian that works with the other Jewish judge. And the task of this second high office, again always filled by a Christian nobleman, was to represent the king and act in his name in all matters pertaining to the Jews of the realm. And as a result of the creation of this office, all the affairs of the Jews are now sort of centralized by these 2 non-Jews. They spent most of their time at the royal court, but if an important case arose anywhere in the country, they traveled to the spot, or they sent one of their deputies to settle the matter. And much of their work concentrates in what are become known as the royal free cities, the privileged royal cities. This is the place where the Jews naturally choose to live. They want to be near the king. They want to be under his authority. They trust him much more than the noblemen, and they know that they hope that they have the protection of the king. Again, it really depends on how far the king is influenced by the pressure of the church versus actually wanting and choosing to protect his Jews. So these royal cities were the primary location where Jews settled, since they preferred to be the property of the king. They granted certain privileges by the king, as we see, to rule out the possibility of the control of the Hungarian nobility, and hence royal and exercised some self-government in relation to their internal affairs, and therefore free. So let us stop here by noting that by the end of the 15th century, there were 3,500 to, I would say, 4,000 Jews in Hungary out of a total population of over 2 million. And I hope that in my first lecture, we have been able to understand the sort of environment that our Jews are living in. Life in Hungary will never be easy, but as I will show you, these Jews fight hard to defend some kind of equilibrium so that they can live as peacefully as possible. Thank you very much for joining me.